I thought I'd found my biological father after 25 years of searching, until I discovered the lab had given me someone else's DNA results. What happened next turned my entire world upside down and taught me that sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most beautiful discoveries. My name is Sarah. I'm 28 years old. For most of my life, I've been haunted by one simple question. Who is my real father? My mom, bless her heart, raised me as a single parent in Portland, Oregon. She was just 17 when she had me, and whenever I asked about my dad, she'd get this distant look in her eyes and change the subject. He was just someone I knew briefly, honey. It's better this way, she'd say, stroking my hair. Growing up without knowing half of my genetic story felt like walking around with one shoe missing. I'd stare at myself in the mirror, wondering which features came from this mysterious man. Did I get my green eyes from him? My stubborn cowlick? My weird ability to wiggle my ears? These might sound like silly questions, but when you don't know where you come from, every little detail feels monumentally important. My mom worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, waitressing at a diner during the day and cleaning offices at night. I rarely saw her, but I never doubted her love. She'd leave little notes in my lunchbox with hearts and encouraging words. "You're my sunshine, baby girl," they'd always say. But even sunshine needs to know where it rises from, you know? When I turned 16, I became more persistent about learning my father's identity. My mom finally broke down and told me his name was David Martinez. She said he was a college student from California who was visiting Portland for the summer. They had a brief relationship, and when she found out she was pregnant, he'd already gone back to school. She never told him about me because, in her words, he had his whole life ahead of him, and I didn't want to complicate things. I spent hours online searching for David Martinez from California, born around 1975. Do you know how many David Martinezes there are in California? It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, made entirely of needles. I found Facebook profiles, LinkedIn accounts, Instagram pages, dozens of men who could potentially be my father. Some were married with kids, others were single, some were successful businessmen, others were artists or teachers. I created elaborate fantasies about each one, imagining what it would be like to meet them, to finally have that father-daughter relationship I'd always craved. My mom's health started declining. When I was in college, she'd developed diabetes and wasn't managing it well, probably because she was still working those 2 jobs and couldn't afford proper health care. I remember sitting with her in the hospital one evening after she'd had a particularly bad episode. I brought up my father again. This time, her reaction was different. Instead of changing the subject, she started crying. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," she whispered, grabbing my hand. "I wasn't completely honest about your father. My heart started racing. Was he married when they met? Was there something dark about him she was protecting me from? The truth is, I was seeing a few different people that summer. I was young and confused and dealing with some personal stuff. David was one of them, but there were 2 others. I named David because he seemed like the most stable option for a father figure. The revelation hit me like a truck. Not only did I not know who my father was, but my mom didn't know either. She gave me the names of the other 2 men, Robert Chen and Marcus Williams. 3 potential fathers. 3 men who might have no idea I existed. 3 different paths my life story could have taken. After Mom passed away 2 years later from complications related to her diabetes, I felt more alone than ever. The grief was overwhelming, but underneath it was this burning need to find my biological father. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It felt like a missing piece of my identity that I desperately needed to find. I had aunts and cousins on my mom's side, but they were distant both geographically and emotionally. Finding my father felt like my only chance to understand who I really was, and to have that family connection I always longed for. I decided to take a DNA test. It seemed like the most logical first step. I researched different companies and settled on one. That promised comprehensive results and a large database for potential matches. The kit arrived in a simple brown box, and I remember holding that little tube, thinking about how this tiny sample of my saliva might finally answer the question that had defined my entire life. The process was surprisingly simple. Just spit in a tube, seal it up, and send it off. But the waiting was agony. They said results would take 6 to 8 weeks, and every day felt like an eternity. I found myself checking my email obsessively, refreshing the company's website. and reading forums where other people shared their DNA discovery stories. Some were heartwarming reunion tales, others were shocking revelations about infidelity or family secrets. I tried to prepare myself for any possibility, but deep down, I was hoping for a fairy tale ending, a loving father who would be thrilled to discover. He had a daughter and welcomed me into his family with open arms. As the weeks passed, I started having vivid dreams about meeting my father. Sometimes he was David, a successful businessman who would sweep me into fancy dinners and introduce me to my half-siblings. Other times he was Robert, a quiet artist who would teach me to paint and share his love of creativity. Or Marcus, a teacher who would be proud of my education and encourage my ambitions. Each scenario felt so real that I'd wake up disappointed to find myself still in my small apartment, still alone, still waiting for answers. The anticipation was building to an almost unbearable level. I had no idea that the real story was about to be far more complicated than any scenario I'd imagined. When the email notification finally arrived 8 weeks later, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely click on it. Your DNA results are ready. The subject line proclaimed with cheerful exclamation points that seemed almost mocking given how nervous I felt. I'd been expecting this moment for 2 months, but suddenly I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever truth was waiting for me. I poured myself a large glass of wine, settled into my couch, and logged into the website. The interface was clean and professional, with colorful pie charts showing my ethnic background. I was apparently 35% Irish, 28% German, 15% Scandinavian, 12% Eastern European, and 10% broadly sub-Saharan African. That last part was intriguing, since my mom never mentioned any African heritage. But genetic surprises weren't uncommon, according to the forums I'd been reading. But I wasn't here for the ethnicity breakdown. I was here for family connections. I clicked on the DNA Relatives tab with bated breath, and there it was. A list of potential relatives ranked by genetic similarity. At the top was a match labeled as close family, with a confidence level of 99.8%. The profile name was simply 1975 German marks with no photo. My heart nearly exploded. DM could easily stand for David Martinez, and 1975 was the birth year my mom had given me. This had to be him. This had to be my father. I clicked on the profile immediately, but there wasn't much information. The account was fairly new, created just 3 months earlier, and the only details were male, age 47, location, San Diego, California. No personal photos, no family tree, no additional information. But the genetic connection was undeniable. This person shared enough DNA with me to be a parent, and all the basic details matched what I knew about David Martinez. I spent the next hour staring at that profile, trying to decide how to make contact. The platform had a messaging system, but what do you say to someone who might be your father? Hi, I think you might have gotten my mom pregnant 28 years ago. It felt too casual for such a momentous moment. But I also didn't want to overwhelm him with a novel-length message. Finally, I settled on something simple. Hi there. Just received my DNA results and it shows we're closely related. I'm 28 years old, born in Portland, Oregon in 1995. My mother's name was Linda Thompson. Would you be willing to chat sometime? I'd love to learn more about our connection. Best regards, Sarah. I must have rewritten that message 20 times before I finally hit send. Then I immediately regretted it. Was I being too forward? Should I have been more cautious? What if this man had no idea I existed, and my message turned his world upside down? What if he was married and this would cause problems in his family? The waiting began again, but this time it was different. Instead of waiting for some faceless corporation to process my DNA, I was waiting for a real person, possibly my father, to respond to my message. I checked my email every few minutes, refreshed the DNA website constantly, and barely slept that first night. 3 days later, I got a response. Sarah, thank you for reaching out. I'm definitely interested in learning more about our connection. I have to admit, this is quite unexpected. Would you be comfortable with a phone call? My number is below. Best David? David. He'd signed his name David. This was really happening. I called him that same evening, and I'll never forget the sound of his voice. It was warm and slightly nervous, with a faint California accent. Sarah, he said when he picked up, and just hearing someone say my name with that kind of anticipation made me emotional. Hi, David, I managed to say without crying. Thank you so much for being willing to talk. We spent 2 hours on that first call, sharing basic information about our lives. He told me he was a software engineer, divorced with no children, living in San Diego. He'd taken the DNA test out of curiosity about his heritage after his mother passed away and left him some old family documents. He said he remembered being in Portland in the summer of 1994 and confirmed that he'd met a girl named Linda. "I remember her," he said quietly. "She was beautiful and kind, but very young. We only spent a few weeks together before I had to go back to school. I always wondered what happened to her. When I told him about my mom's passing and how I'd been searching for my father my whole life, he got emotional too. Sarah, I need you to know that if I had known about you, I would have been there. I would have been in your life from the beginning." Those words meant everything to me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I had found the missing piece of my puzzle. We made plans to meet in person. He would fly to Portland the following weekend. I spent the entire week preparing, cleaning my apartment, researching restaurants, and imagining what our first face-to-face meeting would be like. I called in sick to work that Friday and spent the entire day getting ready. I must have changed outfits 5 times, trying to find something that said, "I am your daughter, and I am successful and well-adjusted." Despite growing up without you, I arrived at the airport an hour early and paced around the terminal, watching every passenger who came through the gate. But something felt off from the moment I saw him. David Martinez was a nice man, don't get me wrong, but when we hugged, there was no instant connection. No, I found my tribe feeling that I'd expected. We went to dinner, and the conversation was pleasant but somehow forced. We looked nothing alike, and several times during the meal, I caught him studying my face with a puzzled expression. "You know," he said over dessert, "I hate to bring this up, but are you sure about the DNA results? I mean, I trust the science, but something just feels—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. I felt a cold dread settling in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. This was my father. The DNA test had confirmed it. We just needed time to get to know each other. But as the evening went on, that nagging feeling that something wasn't right only grew stronger. David and I tried to make it work for the next 3 months. Called each other weekly, exchanged long emails, and he even came to visit Portland 2 more times. On paper, everything should have been perfect. I'd found my father, who was a good man who wanted to be part of my life, and we were slowly building a relationship. But deep down, something fundamental felt wrong. The more time we spent together, the more obvious it became that we were nothing alike. Our conversations felt stilted and forced, like we were both trying too hard to manufacture a connection that should have been natural. He was methodical and quiet, preferring routine and order, while I was spontaneous and outgoing, always looking for new adventures. He loved classical music and documentaries. I was into indie rock and reality TV. He was a morning person who went to bed at 9 p.m. I was a night owl who did my best thinking after midnight. These differences wouldn't have mattered if there had been some underlying bond, some inexplicable familial connection that transcended personality differences. But there wasn't. When I looked at David, I saw a kind stranger who was trying his best to love someone he barely knew. When he looked at me, I could see the same confusion in his eyes, though he was too polite to voice it. The breaking point came during his 3rd visit. We were walking through Powell's Books, one of my favorite places in Portland, and I was excitedly showing him around, pointing out different sections and recommending books. I realized he was barely listening, just nodding politely and checking his watch. Finally, he stopped walking and said, "Sarah, can I ask you something?" My heart sank because I knew what was coming. "Do you consider that maybe we should double-check the DNA results?" he asked gently. "I mean, I want this to work more than anything, but I keep feeling like we're forcing something that should feel more natural." I wanted to be angry at him for voicing my own doubts, but I couldn't be. He was just saying what we were both thinking. "You think the results were wrong?" I asked, though I'd been wondering the same thing for weeks. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but maybe we should find out for sure. What if we both took another test with a different company, just to be certain?" The suggestion hit me like a punch to the stomach, not because I was offended, but because I realized how badly ID wanted him to be my father that ID ignored all the signs that he was undie. I'd been so desperate for family, so eager to solve the mystery of my identity, that I'd convinced myself a computer algorithm was more reliable than my own instincts. That night, After David flew back to San Diego, I sat in my apartment staring at the DNA results on my laptop screen. The numbers were right there in black and white. 99.8% probability of a close family relationship. But numbers don't lie, do they? Except what if they did? What if something had gone wrong in the lab? What if samples had been mixed up or mislabeled? I started researching DNA testing errors, and what I found was both alarming and enlightening. While major mix-ups were rare, they did happen. Samples could be contaminated, labels could be switched, or results could be misinterpreted. Most companies had safeguards in place, but human error was always a possibility when dealing with thousands of samples. It's processed daily by overworked lab technicians. I found forums where people shared stories of incorrect results that had torn families apart or created false connections. One woman discovered that her half-sister was actually no relation at all after taking a second test. A man spent months building a relationship with his supposed biological son before learning there had been a lab error. These stories were rare, but they existed, and they gave me hope that maybe my gut feeling wasn't wrong. The decision to take another test felt both terrifying and necessary. If David really was my father, a second test would confirm it. And maybe we could work through our lack of connection with time and effort. But if he wasn't, then I was back to square one, alone again, with no leads and no family. I chose a different DNA testing company this time, one with a reputation for accuracy and rigorous quality control. I also convinced David to take the same test so we could compare results directly. He agreed immediately, which told me he'd been having the same doubts I had. "Whatever the results show, I want you to know that I care about you," he said during our phone call that night. "If you are my daughter, I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the years we missed. If you're not, I still want to be part of your life if you'll let me. You're a wonderful person, Sarah, regardless of genetics." His words were kind, but they also confirmed what I'd been feeling. We were two strangers who'd have been thrown together by possibly faulty science, trying to force a relationship that might not have any real foundation. The waiting period for the new results was different from the first time. Instead of excitement and anticipation, I felt a mixture of dread and relief. Dread because I might end up back where I started, alone and fatherless. Relief because I might finally understand why David and I felt like actors playing roles we were unsuited for. I threw myself into work and social activities, trying not to think about the results, but the waiting was almost unbearable. Every day felt like a lifetime, and I found myself alternating between hoping the results would confirm David as my father and hoping they would prove our connection was a mistake. 3 weeks into the waiting period, I got a call from David. His voice sounded strange, almost shaky. "Sarah," he said, "I think we need to talk. I got an email from the DNA company about my results, and there's something we need to discuss before you get yours." My stomach dropped. "What kind of something? The kind that changes everything?" he said quietly. "Can you sit down?" I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when David called, but his tone made me immediately sink into the nearest chair. My hands were trembling as I gripped the phone, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "David, you're scaring me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just tell me what's happening." He took a deep breath that I could hear through the phone. "I got my results back today, and they show no genetic connection between us at all. 0% probability of relation. We're not father and daughter, Sarah. We're not even distant cousins." The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he was saying. "That's impossible," I whispered. "The first test showed 99.8% probability. How can we go from being almost certainly related to not related at all?" "I've been on the phone with customer service for 2 hours," David continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "At first they tried to give me the standard line about how DNA tests are highly accurate, but when I pressed them about the dramatic difference in results, they finally admitted they needed to investigate." My coffee mug slipped from my other hand and shattered on the kitchen floor, but I barely noticed. "Investigate what exactly?" "A potential lab error with the first testing company," he said quietly. "Sarah, I think they mixed up your results with someone else's." The customer service representative couldn't give me details, but she kept apologizing and saying they would be conducting a full review of samples processed during the same time period as yours. I stared at the broken ceramic pieces scattered across my kitchen floor, and suddenly everything made sense. The lack of connection, the forced conversations, the feeling that we were both trying to manufacture a relationship that didn't exist naturally. We'd been living a lie for 3 months, trying to build a father-daughter bond based on incorrect information. "Oh my God," I said, finally finding my voice. "David, I am so sorry. I dragged you into this mess. I made you think you had a daughter you never knew about. I disrupted your entire life because some lab technician made a mistake." "Hey, stop," he said firmly. "This isn't your fault, and honestly, I'm glad it happened. Yes. It's been confusing and emotionally complicated, but I've gotten to know an incredible person. You're going to make an amazing daughter to whoever your real father is." We talked for another hour, processing the shock and trying to make sense of what had happened. David promised to stay in touch regardless. We'd been through something unique together, and that created its own kind of bond, even if it wasn't genetic. After we hung up, I just sat on my kitchen floor surrounded by broken ceramic, crying, not just from sadness, but from relief, confusion, anger, and a dozen other emotions I couldn't even name. I was back to square one in terms of finding my father, but at least now I understood why the past 3 months had felt so wrong. 2 days later, I received an email from the first DNA testing company. The subject line read, "Important information regarding your DNA results," and my heart started racing again.
No.
The email was formal and full of corporate language, but the basic message was clear. There had been a processing error with my sample, and my results had been inadvertently associated with incorrect genetic data. They wanted me to provide a new sample for reprocessing at no charge, and they offered a full refund plus additional compensation for the inconvenience. They couldn't provide specific details about what had gone wrong, but they assured me that they had implemented new protocols to prevent similar errors in the future. I called their customer service line immediately, demanding more information. After being transferred to 3 different supervisors, I finally got someone who could give me a clearer picture of what had happened. My sample had been processed correctly, but due to a labeling error in the lab, my results had been mixed up with those of another customer, a customer whose biological father was indeed David Martinez. So somewhere out there is someone who got my real results? I asked, my mind reeling. "We're working to identify and contact all affected customers," the supervisor assured me. "This type of error is extremely rare, but we take it very seriously. We'll be reaching out to everyone involved to ensure they receive their correct results." "How many people were affected?" I pressed. "I can't give you an exact number, but it was a small batch of samples that were mislabeled during a specific processing period. We're talking about fewer than 50 customers total, fewer than 50 people whose lives have been turned upside down by lab errors, fewer than 50 people who might have made life-changing decisions based on incorrect information." I thought about David and how gracious he'd been throughout this entire ordeal, and I wondered how many other families had been affected by similar mistakes. I agreed to provide a new sample, but this time I was more cautious. I researched the company's new protocols, read reviews from other customers, and even called their lab directly to ask about their quality control measures. I needed to know that this wouldn't happen again. The new sample collection kit arrived within a week, and this time the process felt different. Instead of hope and excitement, I felt nervous anticipation mixed with cynicism. I'd learned that DNA testing, for all its scientific precision, was still subject to human error, and that had made me more realistic about what the results could and couldn't tell me. As I sealed up the new sample and dropped it in the mail, I realized that this experience had taught me something important about family and identity. The past 3 months with David had been based on a lie, but the emotions and connections we'd tried to build were real. Family wasn't just about genetics. It was about choice, effort, and genuine care for each other. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, who was my real father, and what would the correct results finally reveal about my identity? 3 weeks after sending in my new DNA sample, I received an email that would change everything. But this time, it wasn't from the testing company. It was from a complete stranger named Maria Santos. "Dear Sarah," the email began. "I know this might sound crazy, but I think we need to talk. I received your contact information from the DNA testing company after they discovered we were both affected by the same lab error. According to the company, you received my biological father's information, and I received yours. My name is Maria. I'm 29 years old, and I live in Phoenix. I think the man you've been calling your father for the past 3 months might actually be mine. I read that email at least 10 times before it fully sank in. Maria Santos was the person who had actually matched with David Martinez. She was his real daughter, and somewhere in the system was information about my actual biological father. The company had mixed up our results completely. I called Maria that same evening, and talking to her was like looking in a mirror. We had the same laugh, the same tendency to talk with our hands, the same habit of starting sentences, and then forgetting what we wanted to say. Within minutes, we were finishing each other's thoughts and sharing stories that revealed dozens of similarities. "I've been wondering why David and I didn't click," she said. He seemed like a nice man, but every conversation felt forced. I kept thinking maybe I was expecting too much from a first meeting with my biological father. "Wait," I said, confused. "You met David too?" "Met him, Sarah. I've been talking to him for 4 months. We've had dinner 6 times, and I was planning to invite him to spend Christmas with me in Phoenix." My heart sank as I realized what had happened. While David and I had been struggling to build a relationship based on incorrect DNA results, he'd also been developing a relationship with Maria based on the same error, but from her perspective, she thought he was her father just like I had, and he'd been trying to be a father to both of us without knowing we even existed. "Maria, I think we need to call David together," I suggested. "He deserves to know what's really happening, and we need to figure out how to sort this out." We set up a 3-way call for the next evening. When David answered and heard both our voices on the line, there was a long pause before he said, "I have a feeling this conversation is going to explain a lot of things." We told him everything. About Maria's email, about the lab error, about how we'd discovered we were both trying to build relationships with him based on false information. The silence that followed was heavy and heartbreaking. "So neither of you is actually my daughter?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, Maria," and I said simultaneously, and then we all started crying. David had been dealing with the emotional complexity of suddenly having not 1, but 2 adult daughters appear in his life. He'd been trying to divide his attention and affection between us, feeling guilty that he couldn't give either of us the full father experience we deserved, and wondering why neither relationship felt as natural as he'd expected. "I feel like I've been living in an alternate reality," he said through his tears. "For 4 months, I've been trying to figure out how to be a father to 2 amazing women, and now I find out that none of it was real." "The emotions were real," Maria said firmly. "Just because the genetics were wrong doesn't mean the care and effort you put in was meaningless." She was right. David had opened his heart to both of us, had tried to fill the role of father despite having no experience with adult children, and had shown us both what it felt like to have someone want to be part of our lives. The foundation might have been false, but the kindness was genuine. "What happens now?" I asked, afraid to hear the answer. "Now we deal with the real results," David said. "The company sent me information about my actual genetic matches yesterday. I do have a daughter, Sarah, but she's not either of you. Her name is Rebecca, she's 31, and she lives in Denver. I haven't contacted her yet, because I wanted to talk to you both first." My chest tightened with an emotion I didn't expect. Jealousy. This stranger named Rebecca would get the father I'd been dreaming about my whole life. While I was still stuck in limbo, still searching for my own answers and my results, I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "They're coming," David said gently. "The company said they'd have your corrected results within a few days. But Sarah, I want you to know that no matter what those results say, you've become important to me. This whole experience has been confusing and painful, but getting to know you has been a gift." Maria echoed his sentiment, and we made plans to stay in touch regardless of what our corrected DNA results revealed. We'd been through something extraordinary together, a case of mistaken genetic identity that had brought 3 strangers into each other's lives and taught us all something about the difference between biological family and chosen family. But as we said our goodbyes that night, I couldn't shake the sadness that was settling over me. I was happy for David that he would get to meet his real daughter, and I was grateful for the friendship I'd developed with both him and Maria. But I was also right back where I started, 28 years old, alone, and no closer to finding my biological father than I'd been before this whole mess began. The only difference now was that I knew how easily hope could be built on false foundations, and how much it could hurt when those foundations crumbled beneath you. The The corrected DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 months after I'd taken my first test. This time, instead of eager anticipation, I felt a mix of caution and resignation as I logged into the website. I'd learned not to trust these results completely. And I'd also learned that finding biological family was far more complicated than I'd ever imagined. My ethnic breakdown had changed slightly. Apparently I was more Scandinavian and less German than the first test had indicated. But it was the family connections that mattered. This time the top match was listed as very close family, with a 95.2% probability. The profile name was Robert Echt_artist, with a location listed as Santa Fe, New Mexico. Robert. My mother had mentioned a Robert Chen as one of the 3 possible candidates for my father. My hands started shaking as I clicked on his profile, and this time, there was more information. He was 49 years old, had been a member of the DNA site for over a year, and his profile included a photo. When I saw that photo, everything clicked into place. Robert Chen had my eyes, the same unusual green-gold color that I'd never seen in anyone else. Had my stubborn cowlick, my slightly crooked smile, and that same intensity in his expression that people always commented on in my photos. Unlike David, who had looked nothing like me despite our supposed genetic connection, Robert looked like he could actually be my father. His profile mentioned that he was an artist and art teacher, and included links to his work. I spent hours scrolling through his paintings, beautiful landscapes, and abstract pieces that showed the same love of color and light that I'd always felt drawn to. I'd never pursued art seriously, but I'd always been attracted to beautiful things. Always noticed the way light fell across buildings, or how colors complemented each other in nature. Looking at Robert's work felt like looking at a visual representation of thoughts I'd never been able to articulate. This time, I crafted my message more carefully. I'd learned from my experience with David that these initial contacts needed to be honest but gentle, direct but not overwhelming. "Hello, Robert," I wrote. "My name is Sarah Thompson, and according to DNA results, we may be closely related. I'm 28 years old, born in Portland, Oregon in 1995. My mother was Linda Thompson. She mentioned that she knew someone named Robert Chen during the summer of 1994. I'd love to learn more about our possible connection, if you're open to it. Thank you for your time. Best regards, Sarah." His response came within 6 hours. "Sarah, I've been wondering about you for 28 years. I absolutely remember Linda. She was one of the most vibrant, beautiful people I've ever met. I always hoped I might hear from her again someday. I had no idea she'd had a baby. Can we talk soon? I have so many questions, and I imagine you do too. My number is below. I can't wait to hear your voice. Love, your father, Robert." When I read those words, "your father, Robert," I started crying. Not the confused, conflicted tears I'd shed over David, but tears of recognition and relief. This felt right in a way that nothing had for months. Our first phone conversation lasted for hours. Robert told me about the summer he'd spent in Portland, teaching art classes at a community center and exploring the Pacific Northwest. He remembered my mother vividly, her laugh, her curiosity about his paintings, the way she made everyone around her feel more alive. "She never told me about you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If I had known Sarah, I would have moved to Portland immediately. I would have married her and raised you together. I've spent my whole life making art, but you would have been my greatest creation." Unlike my conversations with David, talking to Robert felt effortless. We shared the same sense of humor, the same way of seeing beauty in unexpected places, the same tendency to get lost in deep conversations about life and meaning. When I told him about my job in marketing, he laughed and said he'd always been terrible at promoting his own work, because he got too caught up in the creative process to think about selling it. "You got the practical side from Linda," he said. "She was always more grounded than I was. You're probably the perfect combination of both of us." We arranged to meet the following month. Robert would fly to Portland, and this time I felt genuinely excited rather than nervous. I wasn't trying to force a connection that didn't exist. I was preparing to meet someone who already felt like family. The day he arrived, I knew immediately that this was different. When I saw him walking through the airport terminal, I felt that instant recognition I'd been looking for. When we hugged, it felt like coming home. We spent the weekend talking, looking through his art, visiting places in Portland that reminded him of my mother. and slowly filling in the gaps in both our life stories. "I wish I could have saved Linda," he said, as we sat by the river on his last day in town. "I wish I could have been there for both of you." "You're here now," I said, taking his hand. "That's what matters." 6 months later, as I write this, Robert and I talk almost every day. I visited him in Santa Fe 3 times, and I'm planning to spend Christmas there with him and his partner James, who has welcomed me into their family with open arms. Robert has started teaching me to paint, and I'm discovering talents I never knew I had. More importantly, I'm discovering parts of myself that finally make sense. The lab error that initially devastated me turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to me, though I would never have believed that at the time. Yes, it put me through months of confusion and heartbreak, but it also taught me valuable lessons about family, identity, and the difference between what we think we want and what we actually need. David ended up connecting with his real daughter Rebecca, and from what Maria tells me, they have the natural, easy relationship that he and I tried so hard to manufacture. Maria discovered that her biological father was actually Marcus Williams, the third man my mother had mentioned. He's a retired teacher living in Phoenix, just 20 minutes from Maria's apartment. They've been building a beautiful relationship, and Maria says it feels like puzzle pieces falling into place. The 4 of us, David, Maria, Rebecca, I have stayed in touch through a group chat we jokingly call the Lab Error family. Get together once a year, usually around the anniversary of when Maria first reached out to me, to celebrate the strange twist of fate that brought us all into each other's lives. We're not related by blood, but we share something unique. We all know what it feels like to search for family and to have hope built on false foundations. The DNA testing company eventually offered me a substantial settlement for the emotional distress caused by their error. I used part of that money to create a scholarship fund at the community college, where my mother had hoped to study nursing before she got pregnant with me. It felt like a way to honor her memory, while also turning something painful into something positive. But perhaps the most important thing I learned through this whole experience is that family isn't just about genetics. David showed me what it meant to have someone choose to care about you, even when the science was wrong. Maria taught me that sisterhood can be found in the most unexpected places. And Robert gave me the biological connection I'd been searching for my whole life. But also so much more, he gave me artistic inspiration, cultural heritage, and most importantly, a sense of belonging. I still think about those 3 months I spent trying to build a relationship with David. I don't regret a single moment of it, as it was based on incorrect information, but the kindness he showed me, the effort he put into being a father figure, the way he opened his life to accommodate someone he thought was his daughter, those were real gifts, regardless of genetics. Sometimes people ask me if I'm angry about the lab error, if I resent the time and emotional energy I spent on false hope. The truth is, I'm grateful. That mistake led me to David, who taught me about grace and generosity. It led me to Maria, who became the sister I never knew I needed. And ultimately, it led me to Robert, who gave me not just a father, but a deeper understanding of who I am and where I come from. My mother always used to say that everything happens for a reason, though I used to think that was just something people said to make themselves feel better about random events. Now I understand what she meant. Sometimes the universe takes us on detours that seem cruel or confusing at the time, but that ultimately lead us exactly where we need to be. The little girl who used to stare in the mirror wondering about her green eyes now knows they came from a talented artist in Santa Fe, who spent 28 years wondering if he had a daughter somewhere in the world. The young woman who felt incomplete without knowing her father's identity now understands that identity isn't just about genetics. It's about the love we choose to give and receive, connections we nurture, and the family we create along the way. I look at my reflection now, and I see Robert's eyes. But I also see my mother's determination, David's kindness, and Maria's strength. I see all the people who have shaped me, both through DNA and through choice. Most importantly, I see someone who finally knows where she belongs, not because of a test result, but because of love that transcends biology and mistakes that led to miracles. Now, when people ask me about my family, I tell them about my father Robert the artist, my chosen father David the engineer, my sister Maria in Phoenix, my sister Rebecca in Denver, and my mother Linda, who started this whole journey by being brave enough to love people fully, even if briefly. They might not all share my DNA, but they all share my heart, and that's what makes them family. The DNA test that went wrong taught me that sometimes the best discoveries come from the biggest mistakes. and that the family you find is often more important than the family you're born into. Most importantly, it taught me that love doesn't need genetic validation to be real, powerful, and life-changing.